great difference between a Kubrick and a Spielberg is Spielberg is more successful. His films make much more money, but they're comforting. They give you answers, always. The films are answers.
Now, what exactly is Terry Gilliam talking about here? That's the first question I asked myself when I watched this video for the first time. Or to be quite honest, I kind of understood what he meant, but I didn't want to acknowledge this fact. Okay, in order to understand this, let's backtrack a little bit into the history of filmmaking.
Do you dream vividly?
Reasonably so. Yes, I think that's almost the basis of one's work, is the making of nightmares with as much realism as you can.
Frustrated with box office failures, the master of suspense Alfred Hitchcock tried his hand on an unusual story with a seemingly low-budget production, a film that would end up changing American cinema forever. Among many different reasons why Hitchcock's film Psycho exploded onto the world of cinema, the most famous scene from the film, the shower scene, actually killed off the main star of the movie within 40 minutes into the story. Nobody had ever seen or heard of this in a big studio motion picture before. It literally took everyone by shock, audiences and critics alike. People weren't used to this kind of surprises in films back then. And just like real life, expectations weren't always met with the reality of the situation. In the next coming years, with the slow growth of independent cinema, the diminishing powers of big film studios and the beginning of the Vietnam War, the American public slowly began to distrust the government on various political issues, especially their foreign policy.
This key control center has been occupied by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong for 5 years in blatant violation of Cambodia's neutrality.
They felt they were being lied to, not just the motives behind the Vietnam War, but the overwhelming obvious question, how can we fight back against the system? And with that mindset, came the rise of anti-heroes in American cinema.
Just figured on some easy pickings, didn't you, Frank? You know, Texas Ranger, you ain't hardly doing your job. You ought to be home protecting the rights of poor folk, not out chasing after us.
In 1967, Bonnie and Clyde came onto the scene, and with that began the age of New Hollywood. The American audience became sick and tired of formulaic CinemaScope studio films, which were obvious fabrication of reality outside our doors. With the continuing brutalities in the Vietnam War and on the streets of the US, the age of innocence was now being replaced by depiction of graphic violence, sexual content, and experimental film techniques in commercial cinema. This era gave birth to many extraordinary filmmakers like Arthur Penn, Sam Peckinpah, Robert Altman, and later on Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, and Steven Spielberg.
And you'd go to the movies constantly. From all the young people I've talked to who are getting involved in movies, writing scripts, really wanting to be part of the industry, they are willing to make movies that are popular and entertaining and not be embarrassed that the movies make money.
While growing up in the late 40s and 50s, Spielberg was heavily inspired by old feature series of adventure, Flash Gordon, and sci-fi. His fascination with the medium of film and storytelling became extremely obvious. It was almost as if he was born to tell visual stories. With his first two films, Duel and Sugarland Express, Spielberg was still searching for his particular style of storytelling. And then, in 1975, came A Big White Shark. And with that, Spielberg knew exactly which direction he wanted to go in. Unlike many other prolific filmmakers at the time, Jaws had a very relatively linear premise. Jaws not only broke box office records, but ushered in the age of blockbusters. Since the Vietnam War had ended by that time, audiences start to slowly drift away from politics and anti-establishment films and more towards fantasy stories once again. Many film analysts assume that this was the beginning of the studio executives taking back control of Hollywood, away from directors and auteurs. And by 1980, some big budget failures like Heaven's Gate cemented the end of the new Hollywood. In the Terry Gilliam interview, he explains the difference between Stanley Kubrick and Steven Spielberg. Although both highly skilled filmmakers in their own right, one's films can have limitless interpretations to his visuals, while the latter has answers quite obviously within its narrative.
It's Jim at his most desperate. The only time Jim is this desperate to get in the picture is toward the end of the film. And he's so frightened of being isolated and abandoned at this detention center the words are not coming out. You know, when sometimes when you dream at night and something's chasing you in your dream and you're trying to say, Mom, Dad, help me, and you can't, all that comes out is air, just lung air just comes out, not even a full lung full of air.
There's certainly an enigma behind Steven Spielberg's style of filmmaking. Even though his composition of shots, the usage of light, are all splendidly used and acknowledged, his skill as a storyteller has always been simple and never really challenged the audience's opinion. But what exactly do I mean by that? As mentioned before, Spielberg comes from an age where films and stories were mostly exploited for entertainment purposes. Of course, arguably, that's what art in some capacity is supposed to do. Whether physically or intellectually, a film is supposed to entertain you in one way or the other. But Spielberg's asset lies within the art of storytelling, not creating multiple dimensions in between it. For example, Jaws is a pretty linear, coherent story of a great white shark terrorizing the town. After several incidents, the authorities are informed and they set sail to hunt the beast. Casualties occur, but in the end, the white shark is blown into smithereens, and thus the story arc of the great white shark comes to an end.
Smile, you son of a...
A simple tale told in a structured frame, not really challenging you to perceive it in any other way. Now obviously, I'm generalizing the film. There's so much more craft in its tension and storytelling and characters and so on. And Spielberg is a fantastic filmmaker when it comes to coherent storytelling. And similarly, his other films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, Jurassic Park, they're all relatively simple linear stories with a clear beginning, middle, and end. This is known in screenwriting as a 3-act structure. It's the most simple yet the most effective way of telling a story. As I was growing up in the late 80s and the early 90s, I loved Steven Spielberg's work, and rightfully so. His films always had memorable characters, great soundtrack, and a story which was easy to follow. But with all his assets, there lies a major flaw in his works. They are never supposed to challenge you in any way. Engage, most certainly, but never challenge.
I think is down to the fact they're comforting. They tie things up in nice little bows, gives you answers. Even if the answers are stupid, they're answers, oh, you can go home and you don't have to worry about it.
By referring to the big bow at the end, Gilliam wanted to say that Steven Spielberg films are too accessible at times. I always believe that great works of art are always meant to leave you with more questions rather than answers. Questions are what makes us revisit a film from time to time, having a new interpretation every time you watch it, and make conclusions and theories of your own. And among the massive filmography of Steven Spielberg, there isn't one single film that I could have a different interpretation about. It is what it is. There have been instances when Spielberg indulged himself into more serious real-life tragedies, like the invasion of the Japanese army in Shanghai in The Empire of the Sun, the Holocaust in Schindler's List, and the Normandy landings in Saving Private Ryan. As far as technique and storytelling goes, they're all brilliant films. I don't think many could deny that. But here's what lies the problem. Spielberg is trained to tell a coherent story, even if it means bending a few facts here and there. He's never been particularly interested in what different interpretation an audience member might have to a story. As a storyteller, he never allows you that space to inhabit. Where Kubrick's films have always been open to different sorts of analysis, Spielberg wants his moviegoers to feel comfortable while watching his films. Will they end up together? Will he survive by the end of the film? Spielberg's films will surely answer these questions and more, so you as a viewer might not really need to question this factor. As I grew older, I started to appreciate films which were more open to interpretation. They gave me a sense of freedom to express my thoughts into the film's narrative, made me a lot more connected to its plot, its characters, and storytelling. For example, when the T-Rex is first introduced into the film Jurassic Park, I can definitely empathize with the characters trapped in that situation, but always from a comfortable distance. Spielberg makes some really exciting adventurous films, but the audience is always laid back in their comfortable seats thinking, glad it's not me. But with that, there's a sense of challenge lost between the filmmaker and the viewer. What happened at the end of Taxi Driver? Did the handwriting on the letter confirms that Travis Bickle dreamt all of this? Or did it actually happen? Did Joe Buck continue on with his dream to make it big in Midnight Cowboy? Such endings make me question the film time and time again. They continue to inspire me, creating interpretation of my own, and not spoon-feeding me each story arc of the film. Even though I greatly admire Steven Spielberg as a filmmaker, his ability to always play safe and never let the audience challenge his films makes them somewhat less inspiring for me. Now, of course, this doesn't mean a film like E.T. should have a philosophical ending to it. It's very obvious which demographic of the audience Spielberg is targeting. The Spielberg flaw becomes a lot more obvious when he decides to work on real-life events or a narrative targeted strictly towards an adult audience. Steven Spielberg focuses on more survival stories, where the hero ultimately triumphs by the end of the film. A cheer from the crowd, curtain.
I never had a birthday.
His name is David.
But apart from his large collection of films, there might be one film that some audiences have seemed to be divided over its ending. In the film Artificial Intelligence, a robotic boy named David is in search for unconditional love from his mother. The legend has it that he will meet a blue fairy that will grant his ultimate wish. Near the end of the film, it turns out that the blue fairy was just a statue for an attraction at Coney Island. Disappointed but not hopeless, David sits next to the blue fairy, hoping she will grant his wish and turn him someday into a real boy. What if we ended the film AI on an ambiguous note? I think that would have been a fantastic open-ended conclusion to the story, but instead, the film goes on for another 15 minutes, a deus ex machina, clearing all the loose ends so the audience would never have to question the film in any capacity. Some now argue that the ending was more of a what-if situation, and not a blatant cop-out that one would imagine it to be, and thus proclaiming it to be Spielberg's unsung masterpiece. But could this really be true? Since none of the other Spielberg films have such an open-ended conclusion to the story before, this story is extremely debatable. Back in 1924, a similar scenario happened with the silent German filmmaker F.W. Murnau. His masterpiece of a film, The Last Laugh, had a depressing conclusion to the story, so much so that the UFA film studio forced Murnau to conclude the story in a more quote-unquote happier way. Reluctant at first, he finally compromised on it, but not without a title card before it, stating this is more of a what-if situation. Did Spielberg have the same problem? Considering the stature Steven Spielberg has in Hollywood, I highly doubt it. Of course, the irony here is that AI was written by Stanley Kubrick before his death, and the extended happy ending was his idea to begin with.
People assume that Stanley ended AI with David and Teddy underwater, trapped by the Ferris wheel, and that end credits roll. And they're going to be down there until their batteries run out. That's where they assume Stanley ended it, and I, of course, get criticized for carrying the film 2,000 years into an advanced future where the robots they recreated have replaced us.
I'm not sure. Maybe Spielberg actually rubbed off some of his solving loose ends onto Kubrick since they were actually close friends in real life. But who knows? Maybe Kubrick would have directed it in a different way. Even though the story is Kubrick's, the vision by the end of the day was Steven Spielberg's.
And say a few words, so I didn't really prepare anything at home the night before, so let me just talk a little bit about something I said, when a journalist asked me years ago a question I really couldn't answer. They said, what do you do? Why do you do this? And I don't know where it came from, but I sort of turned to the journalist in a flip kind of way. I said, I dream for a living.
But does that mean Spielberg's work are less in any sense of the word? Not necessarily. There is a school of thought in philosophy called solipsism. This notion basically refers to the fact that when reality fails, only one's mind is sure to exist. One needs to refer to his way of looking at things, factors which could be directly connected to your birth, childhood upbringing, and the way you are right now. The reality of your mind is ultimately the reality you can truly trust upon. Which leads us to the phrase, you can't be good at everything. Your mind's reality eventually limits you to become good at everything. Spielberg grew up watching these adventurous sci-fi shorts, which trained him to become a highly talented storyteller, but with a certain lack of questioning behind it. Even though Spielberg most probably lacks the philosophical outlook of Andrei Tarkovsky or the questionable visual backdrop of Stanley Kubrick's work, he certainly is in a class of his own. Although the flaw is obviously there, this doesn't diminish Steven Spielberg's skill as a filmmaker, so I would rather have Spielberg tell the story the way he thinks integrates his skill as a filmmaker the best, rather than having it done in some other form. This is of course a purely subjective perception towards the filmmaking of Spielberg. His films have inspired countless filmmakers throughout the world, and will continue to do so. So I prefer to this less as a flaw, and in some commercial filmmaking capacity, more as an asset. Even though both filmmakers have had almost opposite styles of filmmaking, Kubrick and Spielberg greatly admired one another in real life, which clearly shows that a story in a visual medium should never be limited to any other style of narrative.
Have you ever thought about taking a sabbatical from films for a while? And why, if you did it, why would you do it?
I don't see that happening.
You don't think it would be a good idea to get away for a while? Just
no,
for, you
not
don't,
really. No. I mean, it's really all I know how to do. You know, I mean, I suffered through elementary, high school, and college as a wimp. You know, no sports, no this, no this. I couldn't fix cars. The only thing I know how to do. You know, and I'm making up for lost time.
You're going to stand up for us.
Yeah, I'm going to. It's my first Vendetta film.